Sitzen tut weh. Sitting down hurts. When Greta Schreiber said those 3 words in December 1944, she didn't know she was about to shatter everything the Nazi regime had taught her about the enemy. She expected punishment. She expected violence. She expected Americans to be exactly what Goebbels had promised, brutal, vengeful savages who respected nothing and no one. Instead, 90 minutes later, an American soldier would hand her a folded blanket, and in that moment, the entire war would change meaning. This is the story of how 3 German women discovered that everything they'd been told about America was a lie. A true believer who wrapped her identity in her father's sacrifice, a pragmatic widow searching for her son, and a terrified girl who still believed she'd be home for Christmas. 3 women who expected hell and received something far more dangerous to their worldview: humanity. Because the truth they found was more powerful than any Allied bomb, more devastating than any military defeat. It was the truth that enemies can choose mercy, that even in war's darkest hours there are rules. That dignity doesn't depend on who wins. The hardest benches teach the most important lessons. This is one of them. Flash forward to Christmas Eve 1944, a temporary prisoner compound in Belgium behind American lines. 40 German women crowded into a drafty barracks, and one of them is crying. Not from pain or fear or cold, though all 3 are present. Greta Schreiber is crying because she's sitting on a US Army blanket, and it doesn't hurt as much as it should. And that simple fact is destroying everything she thought she knew about the world. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why a blanket could break someone's faith, we need to go back 3 days. Back to when these women were still soldiers of the Reich. Back to when they still believed. December 16th, 1944. The Belgian border. Winter came early that year, and the ground was frozen hard as bone. The German front was collapsing. Not the dramatic collapse of movies, all explosions and heroic last stands. This was the slow, grinding collapse of logistics failing and orders contradicting and officers disappearing in the night. This was the collapse that smelled like diesel fuel and fear. Greta Schreiber stood in the ruins of a communications post, trying to maintain order while the world fell apart around her. 23 years old, Luftwaffe auxiliary, clerical worker assigned to track supply movements that no longer existed for an army that could barely feed itself. She wore a uniform 2 sizes too large and a pair of eyeglasses held together with wire. The wire came from her father's Iron Cross ribbon, the one they'd sent home after he died in Poland in 1939. She'd twisted it herself, careful and precise, turning his sacrifice into something useful. Every time the glasses slipped, she pushed them back up. Every time they slipped, she thought of him. Died for the Reich. Died believing. Died for something that had to mean something, because if it didn't, what was the point of any of this? The other women looked to her because she never showed fear, never questioned orders, never let her voice shake when the artillery got close. They didn't know that inside she was reciting propaganda like prayers, mantras against doubt. Americans are brutal. Americans are vengeful. Americans respect nothing. If you believe hard enough, fear can't touch you. But fear was touching all of them now. Elsa Hartmann didn't bother hiding it. At 38, she was twice the age of most of the women in the unit and had long since stopped pretending the war made sense. Widow, mother, conscripted to cook for an anti-aircraft battery because the Reich needed everyone now, even middle-aged women who'd never wanted anything to do with any of this. Her husband had died at Stalingrad. They'd sent a letter. Very sorry. Heroic sacrifice. The fatherland remembers. She'd burned the letter. Not in rage, just in practicality. Needed the paper for kindling. Her son Klaus was 16. Volkssturm. Old men and children pressed into service for a cause already lost. She didn't know where he was. Hadn't known for 3 months. Every pocket of her uniform was empty, but she checked them anyway. Compulsive habit, looking for letters that would never come. When the American artillery started that morning, Elsa had already been planning her surrender. She'd heard the stories from Eastern Front refugees, women who'd fled the Soviet advance. What the Russians did. What happened to German women when rage met opportunity. The Americans had to be better than that. Had to be, because if they weren't, there was no point in surviving anyway. The youngest of them was 17 and should never have been there at all. Anneliese Fischer. Everyone called her Annie. Reichsarbeitsdienst typist, assigned to military headquarters for 6 months because she could type 70 words per minute and the officers needed their orders documented. She was from Bavaria, from a town with one main street and a bakery her parents had run for 30 years. Wilhelm and Heidi Fischer made the best pretzels in the region. They'd told her so every morning of her childhood. Annie still believed she'd go home, still believed this was temporary, still believed her mother's last words as the train pulled away, "God protects the innocent." But Annie wasn't innocent anymore. She'd typed things, orders that sent men places they didn't come back from, numbers that meant something terrible, even if she didn't understand exactly what. She'd seen officers burn documents in the final days, seen them look at her with calculation in their eyes, wondering if she needed to be silenced too. She carried a small wooden cross her mother had given her hidden in her sock because regulations said no personal items. She gripped it so often the edges had worn smooth. When the barrage came at dawn, Annie wet herself, just froze and lost control and felt hot shame spread down her legs even as the world exploded around them. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. Everyone was too busy trying to survive. The officers fled first. That's what Annie would remember most clearly. Not the artillery, not the chaos, but the moment she realized the men who'd given orders and demanded perfect typing and threatened punishment for mistakes were gone. Just gone. Ran to save themselves and left everyone else to figure it out. Greta tried to maintain order, shouted commands, "Stand in formation. We are soldiers of the Reich. We do not break." But her voice cracked on the last word, and everyone heard it. The wire on her glasses had come loose, and they sat crooked on her face, and she couldn't fix them because her hands were shaking too badly. Elsa was already burning papers. Practical to the end. Anything identifying. Anything compromising. Anything that might make the Americans angrier than they'd already be. She worked methodically while others panicked, and when she finished, she turned to Greta and said quietly, "It's over. We need to survive now." Greta wanted to argue, wanted to quote regulations, wanted to say something about duty and honor and the cause. But the words wouldn't come, because Elsa was right, and they both knew it. The Americans came on foot. That surprised them somehow. They'd expected tanks, vehicles, the machinery of overwhelming force. Instead, it was young men walking through the morning mist with rifles and exhaustion in their eyes. Boys barely older than Annie. One of them, baby-faced and looking half terrified himself, shouted in English, "Hands up, move!" That way. This was the moment. The moment Greta had been trained for in the propaganda films. This was when the brutality would start. When they'd learn what happened to women who fell into enemy hands. She braced herself. Physically braced, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, waiting for the rifle butt to her face. Or worse. The American soldier, Private First Class, David Morrison from somewhere in Pennsylvania, saw her flinch. He stopped, confused. "Lady," he said in English she didn't understand, "I ain't gonna hit you." Then, slower like volume would bridge the language gap. "Just come on," he gestured. "Move, that way. No violence, no rage, just a tired young man following orders he probably didn't fully understand either." They marched for 6 hours, through mud and cold and the smell of diesel and distant smoke. 40 women who'd been soldiers an hour ago and were now just prisoners trying to put one foot in front of the other. American guards flanked them but didn't touch them. Shouted when someone fell behind but didn't strike. Just shouted, loud and incomprehensible but not cruel. Annie stumbled in the 3rd hour. Her legs just gave out exhaustion and fear and the weight of everything. Elsa caught her, held her up, whispered, "You're alive. That's more than we expected. Keep walking." Greta marched in rigid silence. This is a trick, she thought. Has to be a trick. They're waiting. Once we're in the camp, once we're contained, then it starts. Everything the films showed, everything Goebbels promised. You don't show weakness. You don't trust enemy kindness. You wait for the other boot to drop. The compound appeared through afternoon mist. Barbed wire, wooden barracks, guards with rifles. A temporary installation, something thrown together quickly to handle the sudden flood of prisoners as the German army collapsed. Not a permanent camp, not built for comfort, just bare minimum containment. They were separated from the male prisoners immediately. Greta noted this, analyzed it. Separated means vulnerable. Separated means they can do what they want without witnesses. Her father's voice in her head, never trust the enemy, never show fear, never forget what you are. But what was she? A communications clerk who'd never fired a shot, a true believer in a cause that had just left her behind, a daughter carrying her dead father's faith because if she put it down, she'd have to face the fact that maybe he'd died for nothing. The barracks door opened. 40 women pressed inside, wooden benches along the walls, no backs, no padding, no heat, one bucket in the corner for a toilet. The door closed behind them and the waiting began. Someone would come. Something would happen. This is when it would start. But nothing started. Just voices outside, American guards talking to each other, casual conversation. Something about baseball, something about mail from home. The ordinary talk of young men, far from everything they knew. Night fell. Temperature dropped. The women sat close together for warmth, not comfort. Nobody spoke much. What was there to say? Wait. Survive. Hope the morning doesn't bring what you think it will. First food came after dark. Cold sea rations passed through a slot in the door, canned meat, crackers, coffee that was somehow still hot, not abundant, not delicious, but more than they'd eaten in the last 2 days combined. Some women cried while they ate, some couldn't eat at all. Annie forced it down because Elsa made her maternal instinct overriding everything else. You need strength. Eat. Greta ate mechanically, didn't taste it, didn't think about it, just consumed fuel and tried not to let hope creep in. Hope was dangerous. Hope got you hurt worse when reality arrived. They tried to sleep on the benches. Impossible. Too hard, too cold, too much fear, bodies too exhausted to relax. Annie curled up like a child gripping her wooden cross. Elsa stayed awake, watching over the younger women checking empty pockets by habit. Greta lay rigid, staring at the ceiling, waiting. Second day. Roll call at dawn. Shouted commands in English. Line up outside. Stand still. Count off. The women stumbled into formation, trying to remember military bearing, trying to show they were still soldiers, even if nobody believed it anymore. An American officer walked the line. Captain somebody. Greta didn't catch the name. He looked at them with something she couldn't identify. Not hatred, not lust. Something almost like pity, which was worse somehow. Pity meant they were pathetic. Pity meant they'd lost everything, including respect. More waiting, more cold rations, more silence broken only by whispered speculation about what came next. Transfer to a larger camp, maybe. Interrogation, certainly. And then, nobody wanted to say what came after, and then. Third day. The day that changed everything. They were ordered to sit for processing. Documentation. Names and ranks and units recorded for the endless bureaucracy of war. The benches were the same rough wood hastily assembled, never meant for long-term use. Unfinished planks nailed to simple frames, splinters waiting to happen. After 3 days of walking cold exposure, poor food and fear-induced tension sitting down should have been relief. The body wanted rest. Muscles screamed for it. But the moment they sat, relief lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then the pain began. Not sharp pain, not injury pain, just grinding, relentless pressure. Tailbones against hard wood, hip bones taking weight they weren't designed to support. Lower backs spasming from days of stress, finally catching up. The benches were torture in the most mundane way possible. They hurt without causing damage. They hurt without being designed to hurt. They just hurt. Annie whimpered, tried to hide it, failed, shifted position, worse, tried again, still worse. Finally stood up, preferring to remain on her feet rather than endure one more second of that grinding ache. Other women followed, one by one, standing up sheepish and embarrassed but unable to help it. Elsa lasted 5 minutes before she gave up. Just stood, shook her head, couldn't do it. Greta sat longest. Pride wouldn't let her stand, wouldn't let her show weakness. Father didn't raise someone who complained about discomfort. Father died in mud and cold and worse and never broke. She could handle a hard bench. But her body betrayed her. Involuntary grimaces, shifting weight side to side, adjusting and readjusting and finally releasing a sound somewhere between laugh and sob. Sitzen tut weh. Sitting hurts. She said it out loud. Didn't mean to, just slipped out. Bitter observation on the absurdity of everything. Survived artillery, survived surrender, defeated by furniture. The other women heard. Recognition rippled through them. Shared misery becoming shared moment. Yes. Sitting hurts. 3 words that meant we're all in this together. We're all breaking in the same small way. Private Morrison was on guard duty. Noticed the women standing. Approached to find out what the problem was. Gestured questioningly. Pointed at bench, then at them. What's wrong? Communication barrier. No shared language. But pain is universal. Elsa pointed to the bench, then to her lower back, mimed the grinding pressure, made a face. Annie did the same more dramatically. Physical demonstration of discomfort that needed no translation. Morrison looked at the bench, actually looked at it, pressed his hand against the wood, testing it. Rough surface, hard edges, no give at all. He nodded, not understanding the words but getting the meaning clearly enough. Then he walked away. The women watched him go. Didn't expect anything. Why would they? They'd complained and been acknowledged, and that was more than most prisoners could hope for. You don't complain to your captors and get solutions. You complain and get punished or ignored. Those were the only options their experience had taught them. Greta felt vindicated in a bitter way. See, they don't care. All the small kindnesses so far, the lack of violence, the adequate food, it was all just delayed reaction. Eventually the truth would come out. Eventually they'd learn what enemy occupation really meant. But 90 minutes later, Morrison returned. He wasn't alone. 2 other soldiers with him carrying something. Olive drab wool, US Army blankets. Standard issue. The same blankets American troops slept under in the field, folded in neat rectangles. No announcement, no explanation, no speech about policy or kindness or anything else. They just worked, unfolded blankets, placed them on benches one by one, tested thickness, adjusted where needed. One guard noticed a particularly rough section and added straw underneath, scavenged from somewhere extra padding for the worst areas. They worked methodically, practically. Like this was the most normal thing in the world. Like, of course, you put blankets on hard benches. Like, of course, prisoners deserved not to suffer unnecessarily. Like it wasn't even a question worth asking. When they finished, Morrison stepped back, gestured to the benches. Sit. 40 pairs of eyes stared at those blankets, not moving, not believing, waiting for the trick, waiting for someone to yank them away laughing, waiting for punishment for accepting, waiting for anything except what appeared to be simple, straightforward problem-solving. Elsa moved first, always the pragmatist, always the one willing to test reality. She sat down slowly, carefully, like the bench might bite. Her face changed, shoulders dropped, not dramatic relief. The bench was still hard underneath. The cold still crept up from the floor, but the difference was unmistakable, bearable, human. This wouldn't solve everything, but it solved this, right now, this moment, a little less pain. Annie sat next, small gasp escaping despite herself. Others followed one by one, lowering themselves with a mixture of caution and desperate hope. Greta last, rigid with suspicion and something else, something like fear, but different. Fear of violence, she understood. This was fear of her worldview cracking, Fear that maybe the propaganda had lied. Fear that maybe the enemy was capable of mercy after all, and if that was true, what else might be true? What else had she been wrong about? She sat. The blanket compressed slightly under her weight. Rough wool against her uniform. Still hard, still uncomfortable, but bearable. She could sit here, could last through the processing, could exist without grinding pain as constant background. The wire holding her glasses together caught the weak winter light. Her father's sacrifice transformed into eyeglass repair. What would he think of this moment? Daughter sitting on an enemy blanket crying because it didn't hurt as much as expected. Would he call it weakness, betrayal? Or would he understand that surviving meant accepting help wherever it came from, even from those you'd been taught to hate? Greta cried, quietly, trying to hide it. But Elsa saw, reached over, took her hand, said nothing, just held on. That night, lying in the dark barracks, Greta stared at the ceiling. The blanket was still there. Morning would come, and it would still be there. Nobody had taken it away as punishment for complaining. Nobody had demanded gratitude or submission or anything else. It just existed. Problem identified. Problem solved. Move on. And that fact was more terrifying than any beating could have been. Because if Americans were capable of this small mercy, this practical kindness, this acknowledgement that even prisoners were human beings who felt pain, then what else might they be capable of? What else had the films lied about? What else was Greta wrong about? The bench would still be there tomorrow. The wool would still cushion the worst of the hardness. And slowly, inexorably, everything Greta Schreiber believed about the world would start to unravel, thread by thread, pulled loose by the simple fact that someone had listened when she said, "Sitting hurt," and had done something about it. The blanket remained. That was the first lesson. In the Reich, in the system, Greta had known her entire adult life kindness was conditional. Mercy was leverage. Small privileges appeared and disappeared based on obedience, performance, political reliability. Nothing was given without strings attached. Nothing stayed unless you earned it again and again. But through it all, two things persisted: the wool on the benches and the slow accumulation of evidence that maybe everything she'd been taught was wrong. Day 4 became day 5, became a week. The rough fabric stayed folded where the guards had placed it. Nobody demanded gratitude. Nobody revoked it when the women failed to demonstrate sufficient appreciation. It simply existed as basic acknowledgement that unnecessary suffering served no purpose. This violated everything the propaganda had taught them. The films had been explicit. Americans were soft, yes, but their softness was weakness. They had no discipline, no order. Their kindness was chaos waiting to turn violent. Trust it, and you'd be destroyed. But destruction never came. Only small, practical improvements to existence. Day 5 brought the nurse. Lieutenant Patricia O'Brien walked into the barracks like she owned the place. Maybe 30 years old, American Army Nurse Corps carrying a medical bag, and an expression that suggested she'd seen worse things than 40 frightened German women. She set the bag down with a thud that made several prisoners flinch. Medical inspection, she announced in English. Then again, slower like volume-bridged comprehension gaps. Line up. They lined up. What else could they do? Medical inspection could mean anything. Documentation for later prosecution. Examination for forced labor fitness. Worse things nobody wanted to name. But you lined up anyway because refusing meant worse. O'Brien worked methodically. Checked eyes, throats, heartbeats. Professional efficiency without warmth, but also without cruelty. When she found lice in the third woman's hair, she didn't recoil or punish, just marked something on her clipboard and moved to the next. Treatment came that afternoon. DDT powder distributed by guards who looked vaguely uncomfortable with the intimacy of the task. Instructions demonstrated through gesture since words failed. Apply to hair scalp anywhere the parasites might hide. The powder smelled chemical and wrong, but the itching stopped within hours. Immediate, undeniable relief. Frostbite on 7 women's feet received attention next. Warming protocol. Gradual temperature increase. Careful monitoring. One guard brought extra socks, American issue too large but warm. He handed them over without comment, like this was standard procedure rather than going beyond any requirement. Then came the moment that Annie would remember for the rest of her life. O'Brien pulled out a box, opened it to reveal neat stacks of sanitary napkins, held them up matter-of-factly. "You'll need these. Take what you need. More in the supply tent." Silence. Complete, mortified silence. In the Reich, in the Germany these women had known such things were never discussed. Monthly cycles were private shame managed with rags and discomfort, and the understanding that biology was burden women bore alone. Officers certainly never acknowledged it. Male soldiers pretended it didn't exist. Women suffered quietly because that's what proper German women did. But here was an American nurse holding up sanitary supplies like they were bandages or aspirin. Necessary medical equipment. Nothing shameful. Nothing hidden. Annie's face burned red. She wanted to disappear into the floor, wanted to pretend she didn't need such things, wanted to maintain some dignity. Elsa stepped forward first. Practical as always. Took a handful. "Thank you," she said in German, knowing the nurse wouldn't understand but needing to say it anyway. O'Brien shrugged. "It's not charity. It's hygiene. Prevents infection. Matter of fact, medical reality with no embarrassment attached." Other women followed Elsa's lead, quietly, quickly, taking what they needed and retreating. Greta refused initially, stood rigid, accepted bandages for the blister on her heel, but wouldn't take the napkins, wouldn't acknowledge that particular need, wouldn't accept that level of intimate consideration from the enemy. But that night, when her body betrayed her with familiar cramping, and she had nothing, she quietly took supplies from the pile Elsa had set aside. No judgment from Elsa. No commentary. Just one woman helping another survive the basic realities of being human. Greta lay awake that night holding American medical supplies and felt something crack deeper inside. These people were supposed to be monsters. Supposed to be brutal and vengeful and everything the films had promised. But monsters didn't think about menstrual hygiene. Monsters didn't prevent infections in prisoners they could just as easily ignore. What did it mean when the enemy treated you more humanely than your own officers ever had? Day 7 brought the bacon. The smell came first. Hit the barracks like a physical thing, rich and smoky and completely foreign. The women used to thin soup and black bread and whatever scraps the German army could spare for auxiliary units didn't recognize it at first, just knew it was meat, real meat, frying somewhere close. Breakfast arrived on metal trays, scrambled eggs from powder but hot. Coffee that was actually coffee, not the acorn substitute they'd been drinking for a year. Bread. And strips of something dark and glistening with fat. Bacon. American style. Fried crisp. Salt and smoke and richness that seemed impossible. Annie stared at her portion like it might bite her. What is that smell? She'd grown up in a bakery. Her father made pretzels and black bread and the occasional sausage on Sundays. Meat was thin slices, carefully rationed special occasion luxury. This was something else entirely. She took a bite. Her eyes went wide. Tears followed immediately. She couldn't help it. Couldn't stop it. Fat and salt and smoke and flavors she had no words for, no framework to process. This was what food could be when a country wasn't starving. This was ordinary breakfast for American soldiers. She wept while she chewed, tears running down her face, mixing with bacon grease, not caring who saw. Morrison on guard duty noticed. Is she okay? Concerned, like maybe the food was poisoned or the girl was having some kind of crisis. Sergeant Chen, arriving for his shift, glanced over. Older than Morrison by almost a decade. Chinese features that still drew suspicious looks from some of the other American soldiers, despite being second-generation San Francisco born. He'd learned to read situations that crossed cultural boundaries. She's fine. She's just never had real American bacon before. The other women ate more slowly but with similar reverence. This wasn't punishment rations. This wasn't starvation disguised as discipline. This was the same food American rear echelon troops received. Equal portions, equal quality. The Geneva Convention made law and enforced through supply chains and oversight. Greta ate mechanically. Wouldn't let herself enjoy it. Wouldn't let herself acknowledge that this was better than anything the Wehrmacht had provided its own soldiers in months. Just consumed fuel and tried to ignore the way her body responded to actual nutrition. But even she couldn't deny the difference. Food mattered, not just for survival, but for what it represented. You fed people this well when you saw them as human, when their suffering wasn't the point, when the rules mattered more than revenge. The days accumulated, small mercies piling up like evidence in a trial Greta didn't want to attend. Extra clothing distributed when supply allowed. Oversized field jackets that swallowed the smaller women but provided actual warmth. Gloves appeared mismatched but functional. One guard brought wool socks in 3 sizes and let the women sort themselves out, rather than imposing arbitrary distribution. The guards themselves were a constant source of confusion. Young mostly. Bored with guard duty but not cruel about it. They talked among themselves about baseball scores and girls back home and complaints about food that would have seemed like paradise to the prisoners listening. Normal conversation, normal concerns, normal human beings doing a job they found tedious. Nothing like the propaganda promised. No rage, no brutality, no evidence of the degeneracy and chaos the films had depicted. Just tired young men following regulations they probably found annoying. Sergeant Chen was different from the others. Older, calmer, never raised his voice even when the other guards shouted. He read books on duty, actual novels pulled from his pack, and seemed more interested in getting through his shift than asserting authority. His presence raised questions the women whispered about at night. Chinese, American, how did that work? The propaganda had been clear about American racial policies. Whites degrading themselves by mixing with inferior races. Chaos and contamination. But here was Chen wearing the same uniform, holding the same rank, treated with apparent respect by the white soldiers around him. Unless the films had lied about that too. Day 9 brought the cross incident. Surprise inspection. Military police arriving without warning to check for contraband security violations, anything that might compromise the compound. Standard procedure, but terrifying nonetheless. The women stood at attention while strangers rifled through their meager possessions. Annie panicked. The wooden cross, her mother's last gift, hidden in her sock because regulations prohibited personal items. She'd kept it secret for a week, checking compulsively to make sure it was still there, still safe. Her last physical connection to home. The MP corporal found it within 30 seconds, held it up between thumb and forefinger. Religious item. Confiscate per Regulation 7-42. Annie's face crumbled. She couldn't speak English, couldn't protest, couldn't explain what it meant or beg them to reconsider. Just watched her last piece of home about to disappear into an evidence bag. Chen intervened. Corporal, that's a cross. Not a weapon. Not contraband. Religious items are protected under Geneva Convention Article 34, subsection 2. The MP turned. Regulations say personal items are prohibited. I know what regulations say. I also know what the Geneva Convention says. His voice stayed calm, but something underneath suggested this wasn't negotiable. Your choice which one you want to explain to the Inspector General when he does his rounds next week. The corporal hesitated. Calculation visible on his face. Rules versus rules. Which ones mattered more? Which ones would cause more paperwork if violated? He tossed the cross back to Annie, moved on to the next bunk. Chen spoke to Annie in broken German pieced together from his grandmother's lessons decades ago. Keep it. Just be more careful where you hide it. Annie couldn't speak, could only nod, clutched the cross so hard the edges cut into her palm, tears streaming down her face, but different tears than before. Not despair. Something else. Something like hope mixed with confusion, mixed with gratitude she didn't know how to process. Greta watched this exchange from across the barracks, watched a Chinese-American sergeant quote Geneva Convention rules to override standard operating procedure, watched him defend a German prisoner's right to a religious item when he could have just as easily looked away. The ideology cracked further. The films had taught racial hierarchy. Aryans at the top, everyone else in descending order of worthlessness. Asians near the bottom. Americans chaotic and weak because they mixed races and cultures without understanding the contamination it caused. But here was Chen demonstrating more honor and principle than any German officer Greta had served under. If he was inferior, why was he better? Elsa noticed Greta's expression, saw the internal war playing out. You're starting to see it, aren't you? See what? That we were the bad guys? Greta wanted to argue, wanted to defend her father's sacrifice, the cause, the meaning she'd built her entire adult life around. But the words wouldn't come, because Elsa might be right. And if Elsa was right, then everything was wrong. The sacrifice was waste. The cause was evil. The meaning was lie. Easier to focus on survival, easier to stop thinking. But thinking wouldn't stop. Week 2 brought the escape attempt. 2 young prisoners, Heidi and Christina, barely out of their teens, planned it in whispers after lights out. They'd heard rumors. Russians advancing from the east. Maybe possible to reach German lines. Maybe possible to go home before the final collapse. Desperate hope driving desperate planning. They cut the fence on night 16. Used wire cutters stolen from a supply shed, working in the darkness while others slept or pretended to sleep. Got maybe 200 yards before the patrol found them. Dogs, searchlights, shouted commands to stop. They were brought back muddy and exhausted and terrified. The compound went on lockdown. Guards doubled, tension thick enough to choke on. The women waited for collective punishment. That's how it worked. 2 people break the rules, everyone suffers. Reduced rations for a week, extra work details, maybe beatings to teach loyalty. Standard procedure in every system they'd known. Greta had overheard the escape planning. Every word. She'd faced a choice. Inform the guards and betray her own people. Stay silent and risk punishment when it was discovered she'd known. She'd chosen silence. Not out of loyalty to Heidi and Christina, out of curiosity. She wanted to see what the Americans would do. Wanted to test whether the mercy so far was real or just delayed cruelty. Morning roll call came. All 40 women lined up. American officers walking the line. Captain Williams stopped. Faced the group. 2 prisoners attempted escape last night. They have been separated pending disciplinary action. The rest of you, your rations continue as scheduled. Your privileges remain unchanged. You are not responsible for their choices. Chen translated to German, making sure everyone understood. Individual accountability. You don't punish the group for one person's actions. Stunned silence. Greta's knees nearly buckled. In the German system, everyone would have paid. In Soviet camps, from the stories she'd heard, they'd have shot 1 in 10 as lesson. But here, nothing. Just acknowledgement that 2 people made a choice and 2 people faced consequences. Everyone else continued as before. Elsa whispered, "This is what justice looks like." 3 days later, Heidi and Christina returned from isolation. Bruised from the capture struggle, exhausted from interrogation, but otherwise unharmed. Fed the same rations, given the same blankets. No permanent punishment beyond the temporary separation. They described their interrogation in whispers that night. American officer asking questions. Why did you run? Where were you going? What did you expect to find? Not threats, not violence, just questions asked over and over, like the officer genuinely wanted to understand the thought process behind the escape attempt. When they couldn't answer coherently, when it became clear they'd been driven by desperation rather than planning, the questions stopped. The officer had sighed. "You're safe here." "You know that now, right?" They hadn't known how to respond. Safe was not a word that applied to prisoners of war. Safe was not something you expected from enemies. But he'd seemed to mean it. Genuinely confused why they'd risk injury fleeing something that wasn't actively harming them. The escape became turning point. Not because it succeeded, but because it failed and nothing terrible happened. Because the system held. Because the rules applied even when they protected people who'd just violated other rules. Greta felt her worldview collapsing in slow motion. Everything she'd believed, everything her father died for, everything the Reich had promised, it was built on lies. The enemy wasn't chaotic or weak or degenerate. The enemy had rules and followed them even when following them was inconvenient. Even when revenge would have been easier. The enemy was better than they were. And that truth was unbearable. December 24th arrived cold and grey. Christmas Eve in a prisoner compound in Belgium. The war grinding on somewhere beyond the barbed wire. News filtering in of American advances, German retreats, the slow, inevitable collapse. But inside the barracks, 40 women expected nothing. Holidays didn't exist for prisoners. Days blended together in grey sameness. Survival was the only calendar that mattered. Evening brought surprise. Guards carried in a small pine tree, maybe 4 feet tall, decorated with paper chains made by American soldiers' children and mailed to the front. Crude ornaments, strings of popcorn, evidence of home and normalcy and traditions maintained even in war. They set it up in the corner, said nothing, just positioned it and stepped back. Red Cross packages appeared next, 1 per woman, saved specifically for this day, distributed without ceremony but with clear intention. This was Christmas, even here, even now. Some things mattered more than war. The packages contained canned ham, crackers, chocolate bar cigarettes for those who wanted them. Luxury beyond measure for women who'd been eating survival rations for weeks. Chen stood at the front of the barracks, visibly uncomfortable. Captain Williams sent me to teach you silent night. In English. Orders. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The women stared at him with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. What was this forced assimilation mockery of their traditions test of compliance? Chen started singing. Badly. Off-key. Clearly embarrassed but following orders. Silent night, holy night. Annie started crying. Then singing. In German. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. The words she'd sung every Christmas Eve of her life. The words her mother had sung to her as a child. The words that meant home and safety and everything she'd lost. Other voices joined, tentative at first, then stronger. All is calm, all is bright. German and English mixing, neither side quite matching the other's melody, but meaning aligning perfectly. Holy infant, so tender and mild. The American guards stood at attention. Some hummed along. Morrison had tears in his eyes. These were enemy soldiers. These were the people they'd been fighting. But they were also just scared women singing Christmas carols in a freezing barracks, and that meant something. When the song ended, Chen distributed Red Cross postcards. You can write home, 25 words maximum. Through neutral Switzerland. We'll make sure they're mailed. 25 words to tell your family you were alive. 25 words to span the distance between war and home. 25 words to say everything that mattered. Annie wrote to her parents, I am alive. I am safe. Americans feed us. I miss your bread. I love you. Coming home soon. She didn't know if it was true, the coming home soon part, but she needed to believe it, needed them to believe it, needed those words to exist in the world, even if reality proved otherwise. Elsa wrote to Klaus, not knowing if he was alive to receive it. My son, if you get this, know I'm alive in American hands. They treat us well. Find me when war ends. She folded the postcard carefully, handed it to Chen, looked him in the eye. Thank you. In English. The first English she'd attempted. He nodded, took the postcard, said nothing. Greta stared at her blank postcard for long minutes. Father dead. Mother in Dresden probably dead in the bombing. No one left to write to. No one waiting to hear she'd survived. The loneliness hit like physical pain. She handed the blank postcard back to Chen. Can't write it. No one to send it to. He took it. Didn't comment on the tragedy of that statement. Just took it. That night, Greta found an extra chocolate ration by her place on the bench. No note, no explanation, just chocolate that hadn't been there before. She picked it up, stared at it. First gift since her father's death 6 years ago, from a Chinese-American enemy soldier, from someone who had no reason to show kindness, from someone who'd chosen mercy anyway. She ate it slowly, tasted salt from tears mixing with sweetness, tasted the collapse of everything she'd believed, tasted the terrible freedom of admitting you'd been wrong. The war would end soon. Everyone could feel it. But for Greta Schreiber, the hardest war was just beginning. The war between who she'd been and who she might become. The war between the lies she'd believed and the truth she could no longer deny. And sitting on an American blanket eating American chocolate on Christmas Eve 1944, she surrendered. Not to the United States Army. They'd captured her body weeks ago. She surrendered to the possibility that mercy was stronger than hatred, that rules mattered more than revenge, that even in war's darkest hours, humanity could survive if someone chose to protect it. Decades would pass, but some truths endured. The memory of rough wool against cold wood, the choice to ease suffering when cruelty would have been simpler, the knowledge that even enemies could choose humanity. And slowly, painfully, Greta began to imagine what it might mean to live in a world where those things were possible. February came with mud and the smell of thaw, the kind of cold that seeps into bones and stays there, but different from January's killing freeze. This was the cold of endings. The war was dying. Everyone could feel it in the way guards talked, the way news filtered through, the way even the most optimistic German prisoners stopped pretending liberation was coming. But for 3 women in a Belgian compound, a different kind of reckoning was approaching. One that had nothing to do with military victory and everything to do with confronting what they'd been part of. The newspapers came first. Delayed by weeks, filtered through Red Cross channels, carrying images that would burn themselves into memory forever. Liberation of Majdanek, liberation of Auschwitz. Photographs that couldn't be propaganda because no propagandist would imagine horrors this specific. The Red Cross inspector brought them personally. A Swedish man whose neutrality was supposed to make him safe, but whose eyes carried the weight of what he'd seen. He didn't editorialize, just distributed the papers and stepped back. Let the evidence speak. 40 women passed the newspapers between them in silence. Some couldn't look. Some couldn't look away. The images were grainy black and white, but clarity didn't require color. Skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood. Living people who looked like corpses. Children with eyes that had seen things children should never see. Guard towers and barbed wire and systematic industrial death. Annie's reaction was immediate denial. Lies. American propaganda. They faked it. Her voice rising, desperate, needing someone to confirm this couldn't be real. We would have known. Someone would have said something. But even as she said it, she remembered. Orders she'd typed, numbers that hadn't made sense, columns of figures labeled resettlement, but never quite adding up. Officers who burned documents in the final days and looked at her with calculation, wondering if she knew too much. Elsa went grey, sat down hard on the bench like her legs had stopped working, whispered fragments. I heard rumours. From the east, women fleeing. They said things, but I thought I told myself they were exaggerating. People exaggerate. Fear makes you see things worse than they are. Oh God. Oh my God. What did we do? Greta's response moved through stages like grief. First, defensive anger. This is enemy propaganda, designed to break us, make us hate ourselves. It's what they do. It's psychological warfare. Second, desperate rationalization. Even if some of this is true, we didn't know. We were soldiers, following orders. You can't blame everyone for what some people did in secret. Third, the collapse of every defense she'd built, because she had known. Not specifics, maybe not the industrial scale, but she'd known something was wrong, had heard things, seen things, made choices to look away because looking meant having to act, and acting meant risking everything. Her father had died believing in this. She'd wrapped her entire identity in his sacrifice, in the meaning it had to have, in the cause that had to be righteous, because otherwise, what was the point of any of it? But the point had been evil. The cause had been genocide. The sacrifice had been for monsters. She found Chen on guard duty, walked up to him with the newspaper clutched in shaking hands. "Is this real?" Her English broken accent thick, but the question clear enough. "These photos. Is this real?" Chen looked at her with something like sorrow. "Yes." "I'm sorry, but yes." "Then why?" Her voice breaking. "Why are you treating us like humans?" The question hung between them. Why feed people who served this? Why give blankets to prisoners whose government had done that? Why show mercy to those who'd enabled the unforgivable? Chen's answer would stay with her for the rest of her life. Because that's what you are. Human beings who made terrible choices or had terrible choices made for you. But the Geneva Convention doesn't say treat POWs well unless their side was evil. It just says treat them well. Period. Because once you start deciding who deserves humanity and who doesn't, once you make that choice, you become the thing you're fighting against. He paused, looked at the newspaper she held, looked back at her face. You can't undo what happened. Neither can I. But we can choose what happens next. You can choose who you become after this. And that choice, that's the only thing that matters now. Greta broke. 6 years since her father's death. 6 years of rigid loyalty and denied doubt and faith maintained through willpower alone. 6 years of building identity on sacrifice that turned out to be for nothing worse than nothing, for evil so vast she had no framework to contain it. She cried like she'd never cried, wailing sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal. The sound of a worldview shattering, the sound of everything you believed revealed as lie, the sound of having to rebuild yourself from nothing with no foundation to stand on. Elsa held her. Annie held her. Women who barely knew her held her because they understood. They were all breaking in the same way, all facing the same terrible reckoning, all realizing that survival meant confronting what they'd been part of. Chen stood outside the barracks, listening to a true believer's faith shatter into pieces, and quietly wiped his own eyes. This was victory, maybe. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like watching someone die and be born simultaneously. Painful and necessary and awful to witness. March brought crisis of a different kind. Annie stopped eating. Day by day she withdrew, sat on her bench staring at nothing. The photographs had broken something in her that blankets and bacon couldn't fix. She was 17, had typed orders, had been part of the machine. Didn't matter that she hadn't known. Didn't matter that she'd been a child. Old enough to type meant old enough to be guilty. "I should have known," she whispered to Elsa. "I should have asked questions, should have refused, should have done something." Elsa's comfort rang hollow. You were a child. You didn't know. But Annie couldn't hear it. Couldn't accept absolution she didn't believe she deserved. Night of March 8th, Annie took her wooden cross and walked toward the fence. Not running, not escaping, just walking with the deliberate pace of someone who'd made a decision. Better to provoke the guards into shooting than go home carrying this shame. Better to end it here than face her parents with the knowledge of what she'd been part of. Chen was on guard duty, saw her approaching, recognized the look immediately. He'd seen it before on battlefields. The look of someone who'd decided to stop living. The particular kind of calm that came with giving up. He didn't shout, didn't draw his weapon, just walked toward her slowly. "Annie. That's your name, right, Annie?" She froze, turned, looked at him with eyes that had already left. "I know what you're thinking. I know that look." Her English was broken, but the words came anyway. "I am bad person. I typed the orders. I helped them." "No." His voice gentle but firm. "You're a person who was part of something bad. There's a difference." "No difference. Same." Chen sat down on the cold ground, gestured for her to sit too. She did mechanically. He started talking, told her things he'd never told the other guards. Personal things. True things. My grandfather came to America from China in 1882. You know what Americans did to Chinese people, then Chinese Exclusion Act. Law said we were inferior, couldn't be citizens, couldn't testify in court, couldn't own property in some states. My grandfather built railroads, died building them. Lungs destroyed by tunnel dust, buried in a mass grave with 50 other Chinese workers. Annie listened, didn't understand all the words but understood the pain. My father was born here but wasn't considered American until 1943. Spent his whole life in San Francisco, spoke English better than Chinese, paid taxes, obeyed laws. Didn't matter. When I joined the army to prove I belonged, you know what happened. Some of the officers didn't want me, said I might be a spy. Me. Third generation. American as anyone. He looked at the fence, at the barbed wire meant to keep prisoners in. Does that make America evil? Does that mean I shouldn't fight for it? Or does it mean that countries like people can be part of something terrible and still choose to do better? Silence. The night was cold and clear and full of stars that didn't care about human evil or human redemption. That cross your mother gave you. What do you think she'd want you to do? Long silence. Annie gripping the cross so hard the edges cut her palm. She'd want me to come home. Then come home. But come home as someone who learned something. Someone who knows the difference between following orders and choosing right. Someone who'll teach her children to ask questions, to refuse evil even when refusal is dangerous. Come home and be better than what you were part of. Annie stepped back from the fence. Her legs gave out. Chen caught her, held her up while she cried. Not the decision to die, the decision to live with it, somehow harder. The next days were recovery. Elsa forced her to eat. Greta, changed by her own breakdown, sat with her in silence. That was its own kind of comfort. O'Brien checked on her daily professional concern, masking genuine worry. You scared us, kid. Annie kept the cross, decided to live with the guilt instead of dying from it, decided that maybe Chen was right. Maybe the only thing that mattered was the choice of who to become next. May 8th, 1945, VE Day. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The announcement came through official channels. American officers informed the compound. Some guards celebrated. Others just looked relieved. The women's reaction was muted, relief mixed with dread. The war ending meant going home. But home to what? Home to a destroyed country. Home to a reckoning. Home to having to live with what had been done in their name. That afternoon, the guards organized a baseball game, tried to explain the rules to prisoners who'd never seen the sport. Morrison attempted to demonstrate, pitched to Chen, who hit a grounder, and tried to explain base running through gesture and broken German. The women watched with confusion, giving way to reluctant amusement. Annie laughed for the first time in months. The sound startled her. She'd forgotten she could still laugh. Coca-Cola appeared. American soldiers' luxury shared with prisoners because why not, the war was over. Annie took a sip, made a face. It's sweet and burns. How does it burn and taste sweet at the same time? Morrison grinned. That's America, kid. Contradictions that somehow work. It was a moment of normalcy in the middle of apocalypse. Young people being young, sharing something simple. The enemy label fading into just people who'd been on different sides of something they'd had little control over. But normalcy couldn't last. Processing began. Documentation for repatriation, medical clearances, destination assignments based on home addresses and occupation zones. Germany had been divided. American zone, British zone, French zone, Soviet zone. Where you came from determined where you'd be sent. The assignments came through on May 15th. Annie stared at her papers with disbelief bordering on joy. Bavaria, American zone. Her hometown was in the American sector. The bakery might still exist. Her parents might still be alive. She had a chance. Elsa drew the Rhineland, British zone. Not ideal, but better than the alternative. She'd search for Klaus there, use Red Cross channels, find her son, or find out what happened to him. Either way, she'd know. Greta opened her papers and felt the bottom drop out of her world. Saxony, Soviet zone. She didn't cry, didn't protest, just sat down and stared at words that meant death or worse than death. The stories from the East were specific now. What Soviet soldiers did to German women, what Soviet occupation meant. Everything she'd learned here, everything Chen had taught her about choosing who to become, it would mean nothing under Russian control. Annie saw her face, grabbed Chen when he came for the next shift. Please, can't you do something? Change it somehow. Chen looked at the assignment, looked at Greta, said nothing, but his jaw tightened. I'll try. No promises. 48 hours of waiting. Greta spent them in numb acceptance. This was justice, maybe. Cosmic balancing. She'd been part of evil. Now evil would happen to her. Fair. But Chen didn't believe in cosmic balancing. He believed in rules and leverage and knowing which bureaucratic channels to exploit. He called in favors, violated protocols, risked disciplinary action, found a sympathetic captain who owed him for something unspecified, made it happen. Greta's reassignment came through. American zone, Bavaria, transit camp near Annie's hometown. Some clerk would get in trouble for the paperwork irregularity. Chen didn't care. When Greta found out she found him, why, her English better now after months of exposure. Why would you do this for me? Because I saw you change. I saw you choose to be better. And I'll be damned if I watch the Russians destroy that. His voice rough. People don't change easy. When they do, when they really do, you protect that. You make it mean something. Robert. First time she'd used his name. First time she'd addressed him as human rather than guard. I don't know how to thank you. Write to Elsa when you can. She worries about you too. Final night in the barracks. 3 women, 3 cots last time together. They exchanged addresses carefully, written carefully memorized. Promised to write knowing mail service would be chaos, knowing they might never see each other again, knowing the promise mattered anyway. Elsa spoke with maternal authority. You're my daughters now, both of you. Act like it. Survive. Do better than we were. Make it mean something. Annie broke her wooden cross carefully, gave half to Greta. Greta removed the wire from her glasses. Her father's iron cross ribbon gave it to Annie. Elsa took off her wedding ring. Melted gold could buy food or safety in emergencies. She split it between them. They slept holding hands. Last night together, last night as prisoners. Tomorrow they'd be displaced persons, refugees, survivors of something that had no name yet. But tonight they were sisters in survival, connected by shared breaking and shared rebuilding. The journeys home were separate. Annie's train to Bavaria moved through devastated countryside, cities reduced to rubble, bridges destroyed and hastily rebuilt, refugees everywhere carrying everything they owned, going somewhere anywhere, hoping for better. She pressed her face to the window and tried to recognize the Germany she'd left. Couldn't find it. This was a different country now, broken and trying to figure out how to be something new. Garmisch-Partenkirchen appeared through morning mist. The bakery stood damaged but standing. Her father Wilhelm saw her step off the train. Ran like a man half his age. Embraced her and wept like she'd returned from the dead. Her mother Heidi joined all 3 crying in the street while other refugees passed by, each carrying their own reunions or failures to reunite. What Annie told them. Americans were kind. Fed us. Treated us well. Met a soldier who saved my life. What she didn't tell them. The photographs. The camps. Her moment at the fence. How deeply ashamed she was of what she'd been part of. She helped rebuild the bakery. Returned to something like normal life. But nightmares came. She hoarded blankets, couldn't throw anything away, kept the piece of iron cross ribbon hidden in her wooden cross. Wrote to Elsa 4 months later when mail service resumed. "Dear Mama Elsa, I made it home. The bread isn't as good as I remember. Maybe nothing will ever taste the same. But I'm trying, like we promised." Elsa's search consumed months. British Zone DP camp bureaucracy, lists of survivors, Red Cross databases, rumours and dead ends, and the slow crushing weight of not knowing. She worked as camp cook, feeding displaced persons, seeing thousands of broken families, wondering if hers was broken forever. September 12th, letter arrived. Red Cross notification. Klaus alive. Soviet POW camp in Poland. Repatriation in progress. Expected November. She collapsed, cried and laughed simultaneously, showed everyone in the DP camp. My son is alive." But when Klaus returned in November, he wasn't the boy she remembered. Tall, gaunt, haunted. 16 when conscripted, 17 now, but looking 40. He'd seen things in Soviet camps. Wouldn't speak of them. Couldn't speak of them. Trauma had stolen his words. Elsa faced new challenge. Rebuilding relationship with traumatized son. She used what she'd learned. Patience. Small mercies. Daily kindness without expectation of immediate results. The Americans had taught her you treat people humanely not because they've earned it, but because that's who you choose to be. It took years. But slowly, Klaus healed. Slowly, he learned to speak again. Slowly, he became someone who could live with what he'd survived. Elsa wrote to Greta. "They treated us like people who made mistakes, not like mistakes themselves. I'm trying to treat Klaus the same way, with mercy instead of judgment. It's hard, but it's working." Greta's transformation was slower, more painful. American Zone transit camp, then civilian employment as translator for U.S. military government. Captain Williams, former Iowa schoolteacher, hired her for language skills and kept her for competence. She typed testimonies from camp survivors, translated evidence for war crimes tribunals, faced the reality of what the Reich had done every single day, no escape, no denial possible. Some days she wanted to quit, wanted to run from the constant confrontation with evil she'd been part of, but running meant the guilt won. Staying meant choosing to face it, choosing to be someone who didn't look away. September 1945. Chen's letter arrived. Brief, awkward checking if she was okay. Included a package. She opened it with shaking hands. Eyeglasses, new ones, military issue, but fitted to her prescription. A note. "Noticed yours were broken. Thought these might help." She held them and remembered everything. Bench, blankets, Christmas chocolate, cross incident. Every small mercy that had rebuilt her understanding of what human beings could choose to be. She wrote back, struggled for days to find words. "Dear Sergeant Chen, I don't know if I deserve these glasses. I don't know if I deserve anything you and your country gave me, but I'm trying to become someone who does. I'm working for military government, translating, facing what we did. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. But you taught me that doing hard things is how we become better people. Thank you for seeing me as human when I wasn't sure I was." They corresponded sporadically over the years. Never romantic, just connection. Two people shaped by war, trying to make peace with it. 1952. Chen visited during duty rotation. They met for coffee in Munich. Awkward, but meaningful. She showed him the eyeglasses. "I keep them to remember that enemies can choose to see each other clearly." The decades passed, lives rebuilt. Annie married a carpenter in 1948. 3 children. Never spoke of war years to anyone outside immediate family. But when her daughter Maria found the wooden cross in 1962, Annie told her. Age-appropriate truth. Simplified but honest. Maria at 14. So the Americans were good. Annie at 40. They were decent. There's a difference. Good means perfect. Decent means trying. And sometimes trying is more important. 1975. Elsa Hartmann, now 69 years old, sat across from her son Klaus in his modest home in the Rhineland. Klaus was 47 now, a factory supervisor married with 2 sons who carried their grandfather's name. For 3 decades he'd never asked about her war years, but tonight something had shifted. "Tell me about the camp," he said quietly. "The American one." Elsa told him about the bench. "Klaus, that's all. A blanket on a bench changed your life." Elsa's response: "When you expect hell and receive humanity instead, yes, that's everything. I learned from Americans that even enemies deserve dignity, that even the guilty deserve a chance to become better. And I taught you that through how I treated you when you came home broken. That blanket saved more than my tailbone, Klaus. It saved my soul." May 1995, 50 years after VE Day, Washington, D.C., Holocaust Museum, commemoration event for former POWs and guards, veterans' families, historians, survivors of the war that had shaped a generation. Greta Schreiber, now 73, arrived on a flight sponsored by the German-American Friendship Society. She'd debated coming, debated whether returning to the country that had once been her enemy made sense after all these years. But the invitation had been specific. They wanted her story. The story of the bench and the blanket and what it meant to be treated humanely when you expected horror. Elsa couldn't travel, too frail at 89, but she'd sent a letter that Greta carried in her purse. "Go for me. Tell them thank you. Tell them the blanket still keeps me warm even now, even though it's long gone. Tell them some gifts last forever." Annie had declined the invitation. The memories were still too painful. The photographs from the camps, the guilt she'd learned to live with but never quite overcome. She'd sent her daughter Maria instead. Maria Fischer, now 47, a schoolteacher in Munich, carrying her mother's story because some things needed to be passed down. Sergeant Robert Chen attended with his family, wife of 40 years, 2 sons, both professionals who'd never known war, 4 grandchildren who thought of their grandfather as the quiet man who gardened and read history books and occasionally told stories that seemed impossible. The youngest granddaughter was 16. Her name was Annie, named after a story Chen had told once about a German girl with a wooden cross who'd almost given up on living. The story had stuck with his daughter, and when she'd had a daughter of her own, the name had seemed right. The museum hall was crowded, veterans in wheelchairs, families clutching photographs of fathers and grandfathers who hadn't survived, exhibits showing the machinery of war and the aftermath of peace, everything documented, everything preserved, everything meant to teach future generations what their ancestors had lived through. Greta stood near an exhibit on POW treatment, read the statistics. Survival rates in American camps versus German camps versus Soviet camps. The numbers told a story that matched her experience. Americans followed rules even when rules were inconvenient, even when revenge would have been easier. She turned and saw him across the room. Chen, older now, grey-haired and moving a little slower, but unmistakably him, the same quiet presence, the same way of observing before acting. She'd have known him anywhere. Their eyes met. Recognition instant despite 50 years and age. They approached simultaneously, neither quite sure what to say after so much time. Robert, Greta. They stood facing each other. Former guard and former prisoner. 2 people who'd been on opposite sides of history's worst war. 2 people who'd chosen mercy when hatred would have been simpler. Before they could speak further, another figure approached. Older, slower, using a cane but moving with purpose. David Morrison, now 72, retired mailman from Pennsylvania. He'd seen the reunion announcement in a veteran's newsletter, driven 8 hours to be there. Morrison stopped a few feet away. "I'm not sure you remember me," he said to Greta. "I brought the blankets." Greta stared. Then recognition flooded her face. The young soldier, baby-faced, Pennsylvania accent, the one who'd listened when she said sitting hurt, the one who'd tested the bench with his hand and come back. "I remember." Her voice thick with emotion. You tested the bench with your hand. You came back. Morrison nodded, embarrassed by the attention. Just seemed like the right thing to do, ma'am. Didn't know it mattered this much. Chen clasped Morrison's shoulder. It mattered. It all mattered. 3 of them stood together now, 2 guards and 1 prisoner. The simple act of listening had rippled forward 50 years. Chen's granddaughter Annie tugged on his sleeve, confused by the emotion she saw in the adults. "Grandpa, who are these people?" Chen looked down at her, then back at Greta and Morrison. "These are friends. We were on different sides once, but we chose to be human to each other. And that choice changed everything." Annie looked uncertain. "But you were enemies." Greta knelt down to the girl's level, took her time. This was important. This was why she'd come. "Your grandfather gave me a blanket when sitting hurt. That seems small, right? Just a blanket, just a bench. But it taught me something I'd never learned before. That enemies can choose to be human. That even in war there are rules that matter. That dignity doesn't depend on who wins." She paused. The museum was loud around them, but in this moment it was just the 4 of them. "I was raised to hate Americans. Told you were monsters. Brutal and cruel and everything evil. But your grandfather and Mr. Morrison showed me that people can choose to be better than their propaganda, better than their orders, better than their circumstances." Annie listened with the serious expression of a teenager trying to understand adult complexities. Chen added, "The Geneva Convention wasn't just rules on paper. It was a choice about who we wanted to be. America chose mercy. Not because German prisoners deserved it after what their government had done, but because treating people humanely, even enemies, even people who'd been part of terrible things, that's what defined us. That's who we chose to be." Morrison spoke quietly. "I was 19, scared, didn't know what I was doing half the time. But they told us in training, follow the rules, treat them like people, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Greta stood back up, reached into her bag, pulled out something wrapped in cloth. "I brought something I've kept for 50 years. She unwrapped it carefully. A piece of wood, maybe 8 inches long, rough and worn and clearly very old. Part of a bench. The bench from that barracks in Belgium, removed during repairs in early 1945, saved by a German prisoner who needed to remember. Chen stared at it, reached out slowly, touched the surface. Morrison did the same, fingers tracing the grain. "You kept this," Chen said softly. "I kept this, because the hardest benches teach the most important lessons." Maria Fisher approached, having been watching from a distance. She introduced herself. "I'm Annie's daughter. My mother couldn't come. The memories are still too hard for her. She wanted me to tell you something." She pulled out a small wooden cross, worn smooth from decades of handling, split in half but still intact. Inside, carefully preserved, a piece of wire, iron cross ribbon twisted into eyeglass repair. "My mother kept this. The piece Greta gave her. And she told me the story. All of it. The fear. The shame. The night she almost gave up. And the Chinese-American sergeant who told her that being part of something bad didn't mean you couldn't choose to be better." Chen's eyes filled. He'd never known the full impact of that conversation. Had never known if his words had meant anything beyond that moment. Maria continued. "She became a teacher, spent 40 years teaching children to question authority, to refuse evil even when it's difficult, to understand that following orders isn't an excuse. She told them I was 17 and I made choices I'll regret forever, but I also made a choice to live with it and do better. And that second choice is the one that matters." Greta Chen Morrison. Maria and young Annie stood together. 5 people, 3 generations, 3 nations, German American, Chinese American, all connected by one moment 50 years ago when someone chose kindness over cruelty. Chen spoke quietly. "What do you want to do with it?" "The bench piece." Greta had already decided to donate it to the museum. with a plaque explaining what it meant, so people understand that war isn't just about battles and strategy. It's about choices, small choices, daily choices. The choice to put a blanket on a hard bench because someone said it hurt. They arranged it with the museum curator. The wooden slat would go in the POW exhibit. The plaque would read, "From a prisoner who expected revenge and received mercy. From guards who chose humanity over hatred. May we remember both what we did and what we could have done differently. This is what America means." The dedication ceremony was simple. Museum director speaking briefly. Veterans gathering in the small exhibit hall. Greta Chen and Morrison standing together. Annie holding the wooden slat before it was placed in its display case. A photographer captured the moment. Former guards and former prisoner. Elderly, but unbowed. Standing together in the museum dedicated to remembering the worst of human nature so that maybe possibly future generations might choose better. After the ceremony, Chen's family invited Greta, Morrison and Maria to dinner. American restaurant, burgers and fries and Coca-Cola, things that had once been exotic and foreign and now were just food. Over dessert, Chen's wife asked the question everyone had been wondering. Do you regret it, being part of the war, being on the wrong side? Greta considered. Long pause. Everyone waited. I regret what my country did. I regret that I didn't question it sooner. I regret every day I spent believing lies. But I don't regret being captured, because being captured, being treated with dignity when I expected horror that saved me. Not just my life, my soul. It gave me the chance to choose who to become next. She looked at Chen and Morrison. You gave me that chance. You and Lieutenant O'Brien and Captain Williams. You followed rules that didn't benefit you, rules that protected people who'd been your enemies. And in doing that, you showed me what real strength looks like. Not the strength to destroy, the strength to show mercy even when it's hard. Chen's response. We weren't perfect. America wasn't perfect. We had our own sins. Chinese exclusion, Japanese internment, segregation, all of it happening while we claimed to fight for freedom. But the Geneva Convention treating POWs humanely, that was us at our best. That was the choice to be better than our worst impulses. Morrison added, my dad fought in the First War, came back broken, never talked about it. But before I shipped out, he told me one thing. Don't become what you're fighting. Hold on to who you are. I didn't always know what that meant. But when I saw you all sitting there in pain, I just thought I can fix this. Small thing. But it was something I could do. The conversation continued late into the evening. Stories shared. Memories compared. Annie asking questions about what it was like to be young during the war. Maria sharing what her mother had told her about coming home and learning to live with guilt. When they finally said goodbye, Greta, Chen and Morrison embraced. Not enemies and guards, just three old people who'd survived something terrible and chosen to let it make them better instead of bitter. Write to me, Chen said. Don't let another 40 years pass. I won't, Greta promised. And thank you for everything, for the blanket, for the glasses, for seeing me as human when I wasn't sure I was. Morrison added, You were always human, ma'am. That was the whole point. The years after the reunion were quiet. Greta returned to Germany, continued her translation work part-time, volunteered at schools teaching about the war from the perspective of someone who'd been part of the wrong side. Her message? Question everything. Refuse evil. Choose to be better than what you're taught to hate. Chen gardened, spent time with grandchildren, wrote occasional letters to Greta and Morrison. They formed an unlikely friendship. Three old veterans of different kinds, united by a moment in 1944 when mercy had been possible. Morrison kept the photograph from the museum dedication on his desk, showed it to his mail route customers sometimes, told the story. Most people didn't understand why it mattered so much, but a few did, and that was enough. Elsa died in 1998 peacefully with Klaus and his family around her. Her last words were about the blanket. Tell Greta it's still warm. She'll understand. Annie died in 2003. Heart attack while baking bread in the bakery that had been rebuilt after the war. Quick and painless. Maria found the wooden cross among her mother's things. Half of it anyway, the other half presumably still with Greta. Inside a note in Annie's handwriting, I chose to live. That was the bravest thing I ever did. Morrison died in 2004, quietly, at home. His children found letters from Greta and Chen, found the story of the blankets documented in journals he'd kept, found evidence that one small act of kindness had meant more than he'd ever fully realized. Chen died in 2005. In his sleep, his family found letters from Greta and Morrison, found the story of the bench and the cross documented in journals he'd kept, found evidence that choosing to see the enemy as human had rippled forward in ways he never fully understood. Greta lived until 2008, 86 years old, sharp until the end. She kept the eyeglasses Chen had sent her in 1945, kept the half of Annie's cross, kept Elsa's portion of the wedding ring, kept all the physical reminders of the women who'd been broken and rebuilt together. Before she died, she recorded her story. Video testimony for the Holocaust Museum archives. Wanted future generations to understand not just what happened, but what it meant. The final image of her 86 years old holding the eyeglasses. These represented a choice. Not my choice, his choice. Sergeant Robert Chen chose to see me clearly when he could have just seen an enemy. He chose to fix what was broken when leaving it broken would have been easier. He chose mercy when revenge was available. She paused, adjusted the eyeglasses one more time. We think war is about battles, about territory and strategy and which side wins. But war is really about choices. Every day, every person. The choice to be human or to be monster. The choice to follow rules or to let rage win. The choice to see the enemy as people who might also be suffering. America made that choice. Not always, not perfectly. But in the moments that mattered to me, to Elsa, to Annie, America chose mercy. Chose to follow the Geneva Convention even when it would have been easier not to. Chose to prove that even in the darkest times, dignity matters. Her final words before the camera stopped. We came to them expecting hell. They gave us benches that hurt, but then they gave us blankets. And in that single moment, everything I thought I knew about enemies and mercy and what it means to be human changed forever. Pain teaches us sometimes. It teaches us that small mercies matter more than grand gestures. That kindness isn't weakness, but strength. That the hardest benches can teach the most important lessons if someone chooses to ease the suffering instead of ignoring it. I learned that in December 1944 when an American soldier gave me a blanket, and I spent the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that mercy. The recording ended. The museum preserved it, alongside the wooden bench slat, alongside testimony from thousands of others who'd lived through the war and its aftermath. Today, visitors to the Holocaust Museum can see the exhibit, can read the plaque, can touch the wooden slat behind protective glass, can understand that the Geneva Convention wasn't abstract. It was blankets on benches. It was glasses sent to prisoners. It was a Chinese-American sergeant defending a German girl's right to keep her mother's cross. It was a Pennsylvania private who tested a bench with his hand and came back with wool and straw. It was choosing to see enemies as humans who deserved dignity even in defeat. The lesson remains. When we make rules to protect even those who've been our enemies, we're not protecting them. We're protecting ourselves. We're protecting who we choose to be. We're protecting the possibility that mercy can be stronger than revenge. 3 women learned that in a cold barracks in Belgium in 1944. 3 women carried it home and taught it to their children. 3 women proved that even in war's worst moments, humanity can survive if someone chooses to protect it. And 3 Americans proved that following the rules when it would be easier not to is the truest form of strength. The memory of rough wool against cold wood persists. The choice to ease suffering when cruelty would have been simpler endures. The knowledge that even enemies could choose humanity echoes forward into futures those women and men never lived to see. This is what America meant to those who expected the worst and received something better. This is what we carried home. If you or your family served during this era, share your stories below. These memories are the real treasure of the greatest generation. Subscribe so they're never forgotten. And remember, the hardest benches teach the most important lessons.